Jesus do and say things that no other earlier gospel has him do and say. For example, he says, I am the light and I am the way, the truth and the life. Before Abraham was, I am. I am the all these wonderful I am sayings are not found in any other historical source. And we have earlier historical sources. And the argument scholars is this: if Jesus had gone around saying these things and doing these things as the last gospel written claims, why does no one record him doing and saying these things? There's not only a whiff of it in any other earlier source that Jesus spoke like that. Also, the other telltale signs that John is a much more interpreted, sermonizing account. Now, what's this got to do with the resurrection? Well, this story, which if it happened, surely would be an amazing story. And no, Mark knows nothing about it, neither does Luke. He's investigated everything carefully from the beginning. He boasts at the beginning. Neither does Matthew. No one else mentions it. Yeah. So this is likely to be a fictitious story made up, as John does, with Jesus' sayings. This is your own scholars say this, by the way. He's not atheists. Your own top scholars are unanimous on this view.
There is no way. Also, they debate the account of John, the Gospel of.
They all say that it is. If you want the historical Jesus, you go to much earlier sources. You see, religious traditions embellish. There's stories made up in the later Muslim tradition about this person and that person. We go back to the original sources that are reliable, and unfortunately, John is not early. It's not considered reliable by the top Christian scholars and others. And yes, I can tell you who they are.
Are you going to say Bart Ehrman and Bruce Metzger again?
No, Bart Ehrman's an atheist, but nevertheless he is a scholar.
But he just doesn't call
But no, but it is standard. I'll give you some names. I don't even know that. Jimmy Dunn, professor at Durham University, or people like Leslie Holden, Graham Stanton, Richard Burridge. These are all top professors in New Testament studies. They're all ordained Christians, in Britain, and then we can go across to America or Germany. This is the standard view of Christian scholars now. The problem is, though, no disrespect to you, the average Christian, I'm not saying you're average, but anyway, the average does not know about this scholarship. There's this big gulf between those who know, who've investigated these, and the average man who doesn't know anything about it. And they simply open the Bible and say, oh, well, it says it there, it must be historical. But Christian scholarship has moved on hugely in the last 2 centuries. That's no longer the case. It's bad news if you're a Christian. When I was a Christian, and I was a Christian, I learned this when I was studying this at university. And boy, did it hit me hard. But we have to deal with the facts. Scholarship, responsible mainstream scholarship, no longer takes the Gospel of John as simple, unvarnished history. It's highly interpreted, late tradition. And it portrays Jesus in a certain way that no earlier source does. Nowhere is Jesus saying, I am the way, the truth, and the life in Mark or Matthew or Luke. It doesn't talk like that.
It would be redundant if all of the Gospels repeated the exact same thing, because then you'd only need one letter for the Gospels from the disciples who were there with Jesus. So it makes sense that they did not say the exact same thing at the exact same time. Inclusively, there are likely to be accounts that were picked up on by some disciples and not others. So when we read all 4 of the letters of the disciples, then we can get a more holistic view of what Jesus was. In relation to the criticisms of John, I am not completely familiar with all of those, but I would say that there is no indication that we should not take John as part of the gospel simply because there are claims by some scholars.
Also, I think virtually, well, I said 99% of scholars.
I don't know about that.
I would say at least, well, I do.
You named 3.
I would say,
how many are there in total?
Well, look, should we go through university by university? Should we go from Oxford, Cambridge, London, Harvard, Yale? No, I can go through them. All the major scholars there are in complete agreement that John is a largely, heavily interpreted account, by which you mean fictionalized, unfortunately. For the historical Jesus, you go to the earlier sources, like you would the Hadith. You don't go to late Hadith, you go to early authentic Hadith. But these are your scholars, not me.
It's redundant. It should appear on the earliest.
Thank you.
Rather than the newest.
Thank you.
It's redundant if all of the disciples who wrote parts of the gospel repeated the exact same thing over and over again.
Yeah, but it should appear on the earliest gospel rather than the newest.
This is a good point, because Luke, for example, said that he was writing an orderly account to tell it. He told you the eyewitnesses to give an orderly account to you, dear Theophilus. So it says at the beginning of Luke, long before John was written. And in his account of Luke, Jesus' life, from his conception to his death and resurrection, nowhere does he ever have Jesus speaking the way and saying the things he does in the later written Gospel of John. He meant to be inclusive. Look at this. If Jesus had gone around flesh and blood Jesus, downtown Jerusalem or Galilee, saying, I am the light of the world. Before Abraham was I, making these extraordinary public claims. Why on earth wouldn't Luke mention this? Why on earth wouldn't Mark mention this? Why on earth wouldn't Matthew mention this? Why would no one mention it until we get to the end of the first century? No one mentions it.
It has to be there.
It's not early, it's late. And that means, because we know in religious traditions, embellishments happen, exaggerations happen. We can see this even in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We can see how when Matthew and Luke use Mark, they embellish and improve the status of Jesus. It becomes more divine. He can do more things and more miracles. We see that.
If that is the focus which they wanted to capture in the retelling of the story of Jesus, that is fine. We have no issue with that.
Why would Luke ignore these marvelous public statements of Jesus? I mean, there's such an important facet of Jesus' ministry. Why ignore them?
I cannot give a reason as to why.
I mean, the light of the
then
world.
He focused on other attributes of
not going to
Jesus.
mention that.
Simply because one does, or one makes these claims in their writings, but not the other, does not then mean that that one is to be ignored. These are all, reading all four will give you a holistic view of Jesus. And I doubt any of those scholars are of the mind that this book should be ignored or thrown out.
No.
So therefore, the lessons that are captured within John are poignant. And so when I talked about Thomas feeling the physically resurrected Jesus, simply because of the idea that John came later in a number of the other Gospels, does not mean that story must be thrown out.
No, it means it's late because it is literally late.
But
it also means if you look at
would any of the scholars who you mentioned, would any of them agree that because of the criticisms for John, that then means that the resurrection was not a physical thing? Would any of them say that?
Yes.
Who? Okay, now we can discuss.
Okay, let me explain.
Tell me of the scholars
if you look at the earliest gospel,
who would
the
believe
Gospel of Mark,
that because John came later, that would then mean that when Paul speaks of the resurrection of Jesus, it was strictly sort of like a vision-wise and not physical.
If you look at the earliest gospel in the New Testament, the Gospel of Mark, we look at the resurrection appearances. Yeah? No. There are no resurrection appearances in the Gospel of Mark. The earliest gospel in the New Testament does not have any resurrection. But you'll say, you get the Bible out, you'll see stories have been added on. Yes, they have, but they're added on later, in the second and third century. How do we know this? If you go to the earliest manuscripts, the Codex Sinaiticus is the earliest complete New Testament manuscript in the world, in just 2 miles from here in the British Library. You can see it, I've seen it many times. It does not have any of these added on stories. We get the earliest evidence they were not there, they were not quoted. These have been added on by scribes. So I wanted to quickly put on the resurrection of Jesus because it's not there in our earliest gospel.
It's not a full account of the Gospels, is it not?
It is. There are no resurrection appearances in the earliest gospel in your Bible.
But
that's a fact.
They are not a complete account of what the letters. I don't believe it does.
What you believe is okay, but it doesn't alter the fact that there aren't any resurrection accounts.
Wait.
Even if you don't believe it.
The Codex Sinaiticus.
I'll show you. I've got the NRSV, which is the standard academic work. Okay, let's look. This is the New Revised Standard Version, the standard academic translation.
We are talking about the resurrection of Jesus, and he's claiming that Paul, a later apostle of Jesus, never held the belief that Jesus was physically resurrected. I disagree.
I meant it in the hard physical sense that John portrays it. Absolutely didn't believe that. And I mentioned the reasons why. Now, you see here, this is Mark. And here we have the shorter ending of Mark. Jesus appears to his disciples. And the longer ending of Mark. These are not original. They are added on. In most authorities, that is manuscripts, verses 9 to 20 follow immediately after. They're not in the ancient manuscripts. So these are added on. You see they've got the double brackets there and there. They're not part of the original Gospels. They've been added. Other ancient authorities, there are further stories. All these stories were added to the Gospel of Mark to include resurrection stories that weren't originally in the original Bible.
The Codex Sinaiticus is carbon dated for what? It's like, what is it, the 3rd, 4th century? Or
it's the middle of the 4th century.
Okay, it's the middle of the 4th century. Clearly, these teachings have to have come from somewhere. So I believe that at the time, manuscripts were written on a very temperamental fabric called papyri, which would disintegrate over time if not properly kept in like a dry and I think cold fashion. So the complete gospels that or the gospel story that we have in the Codex Sinaiticus from the 4th century come from much earlier sources that date back all the way to the 1st century. I don't know if the Codex Sinaiticus has the entire Gospels within it.
Yes, it does.
I think there are potentially parts that are missing, but I will confirm that.
It is a complete New
Saying
Testament.
that something was
It's the earliest copy we have. It
later,
doesn't have the resurrection.
So you're saying we find the earliest manuscript and it doesn't have the part of resurrection, and you're suggesting that this is a short version of what was originally there?
Yes, because we even have letters from church fathers from the 1st century who affirm the resurrection.
No, that's different. I'm not talking about, of course the fathers affirm the resurrection. I'm talking about the end of Mark.
As far back as the 1st century,
yes, it was.
that the resurrection occurred.
Yes, of course.
So simply
it's there in Mark and Luke, and it's there in Luke and John and
simply
Matthew.
Because it does not make it. No, sorry. With the Codex Sinaiticus, you're claiming that which section, doesn't make it in.
Right. I'm just saying, I have to say this already very clearly. The earliest gospel we have, which is in the Codex Sinaiticus as well, is called the Gospel of Mark. Now, the reasons why scholars think this, and we can go into that if you want, but I'm just telling you what everyone, all educated Christians know and accept. It's not a dispute. Mark is the earliest. In Mark's Gospel, the earliest manuscripts we have do not contain any resurrection appearances at all. Now, other Gospels, Matthew, Luke, and John do. I'm not saying it's not there in the Bible. I'm saying the earliest evidence is not there. That's all. It's a matter of fact. This is not in dispute, by the way. I'm not saying anything controversial or wacky or it's totally mainstream. Everyone knows this. You still have your resurrection. It's there in Luke or Matthew or John if you want it. I'm just saying it's not there in the earliest. That's all I'm saying. It's not there in the earliest gospel. And when Paul asserts it, he's not talking about the hard corporeal resurrection you see in John. He's talking about a more spiritual resurrection. He actually calls it. There's more evidence I didn't go into, by the way, in his letters where he talks about flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. He's referring to the resurrection here. He believed it in a spiritual body. He called it a spiritual body. Now, in Greek metaphysics, a spiritual body was not a physical body. It was something ethereal, something more like a vision, a mist, something. It wasn't a hard flesh and blood. That's what Paul said in his letters.
Jesus didn't physically resurrect. Because
Depends what you mean by physical.
Jesus rose from the dead in a physical body.
What do you mean by physical?
Go find out. Go find out. It was new, of course. It's new. Jesus did not resurrect in the Old Testament. It was the new, okay?
And there's a third piece of evidence as well to deny the resurrection of Jesus ever happened.
When I say
which is quite
physically
powerful.
resurrected, I literally mean that the physical body of Jesus Christ was reanimated, escaped the tomb, and physically went and preached to, and stayed with the disciples for, I believe, a month before, or 10 days, or one of those two figures before he physically ascended into heaven. And Paul does not affirm that this physical manifestation did not happen, simply that when Jesus appeared to Paul later, it was visual.
Okay, I don't agree. There's another more serious theological reason why I don't agree the resurrection of Jesus, death and resurrection, crucifixion happened.
A moment.
Okay.
If I may.
Yes.
We were talking about a very specific thing, which is to do with Paul not affirming that Jesus was resurrected physically.
Yes.
You make the case that he did not, and I make the case that the evidence that you're giving is not affirming that Jesus
I would say we
was
have
not
evidence.
physically resurrected.
I would say we have evidence.
But when he appeared to Paul,
we have evidence it's fabricated. That Paul fabricated. There's actual evidence in the Bible, which I can give. It's not based on. It's based on a very particular reading of the scriptures, and it's this.
A very particular reading. Okay.
Yeah. Well, indeed. Yours is a very particular reading as well.
As is yours.
I just said it was.
No Christian has ever believed that when Paul spoke about the resurrection of Jesus, that it was done in a non-physical way.
Well, they have actually in the early church.
Which Christian believed
The Gnostics.
that when Paul spoke about, but then the Gnostics were then talked to by Paul, who then told them that believing in the resurrection metaphorically is not the correct way of doing
They
it.
disagree with Paul and call Paul a heretic. So, coming
That
back,
is true.
Coming back
and
to
then Paul told them that they were wrong.
Yeah, but Paul was wrong, and the Gnostics were right. I mean, it's just like, he said, she
The
said.
Gnostics were not right because the disciples.
Well, they were right on this issue.
The disciples are not from the Gnostics. Jesus.
Okay. Coming back to the real substantial reason why what Paul claims about the death and resurrection, death on the cross and resurrection of Jesus is an invented story, is very powerful, I think. And remember, in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 3, Paul says that this is the gospel, and in fact,